what I want to talk to you about tonight is equality, and more specifically, the relation between equality and responsibility. And I'd like to start with an example. Suppose that you and I are both farmers, and suppose that we start in a situation of equality. So our farms are equal size, and suppose that we have the same amount of wealth at the start of the year. But suppose that through the course of a year, you work really hard, whereas I'm extremely lazy and I don't do anything. Now, predictably, at the end of the year, there is then going to be inequality between us, right? So your wealth is going to increase because you work very hard, and my wealth is not going to increase because I'm very lazy. And now the question I'm interested in is that inequality just or is it unjust? And I think most of us would say that inequality is just. So in other words, justice doesn't require that the state compensates me for having less than you at the end of a year. And why is that? Well, because I'm responsible for having been lazy all year, right? So I'm responsible for the choices that I made that resulted in my now being less wealthy than you are. Right? So that's the first example. Second example is a little bit different. So suppose again that you and I are both farmers. Suppose that we start with farms of the same size, and suppose that we start with the same amount of wealth. But now suppose that we both work equally hard throughout the year. But the thing that happens now is that at the end of the year there is a massive earthquake that destroys my farm. Now I think, so that now again the question is the inequality that results between us that results from that, is that inequality just or is that inequality unjust? So in this case, does justice require that the state compensates me for now being less wealthy than you as a result of that earthquake? And I think most of us would say, well, in this case, the state is required to compensate me, and the reason for that seems to be that I'm not responsible for the earthquake, right? So now the inequality is not a result of responsible choices that I myself have made, and therefore the inequality is unjust. Now what that suggests is that we accept the following sort of view, a following view about equality. And the view has two parts. The first part says that inequality is just if those who have less than others are themselves responsible for having less than others. Right? So justice doesn't require that the state compensates people for inequality if the people who have less are themselves responsible for having less. But on the other hand, inequality is unjust if those who have less than others are not themselves responsible for having less than others. Right? So in the case where I'm lazy, I'm responsible for having less, so justice doesn't require that I'm compensated. In the case where my farm is hit by an earthquake, I'm not responsible for the inequality, and therefore justice requires that I am compensated. Right, so I think that is a very natural view to hold about inequality, about the justice or injustice of inequality. But as a philosopher, I want to ask a question about a presupposition of this view. So I'm interested in something that this view presupposes, because the view presupposes that we are often responsible for what we do. And you might think, actually, that maybe we're not always responsible for what we do, and maybe we're even never responsible for what we do. So here's an example that might help to bring out why you might doubt that we are responsible for what we do. Suppose that I am hypnotized, and suppose that I do certain things as a result of being hypnotized. Now, in that case, I think we would all say that I'm not responsible for doing the things I do. And why is that? Well, because I'm doing the things I do as a result of having certain mental states, as a result of having certain beliefs and desires that were installed in me by the hypnosis. So I'm not responsible for what I do when I've been hypnotized, because I'm not responsible for the mental states that I have while I'm under hypnosis. Now, philosophers have tried to generalize that kind of insight and turn it into a general argument against the existence of responsibility. So what I want to do now is look at that argument against the existence of responsibility. The argument has 6 steps, and then at the end, the conclusion is going to be that no one is ever responsible for what they do. So here's the first step. We do what we do partly because of the way we are, at least in certain crucial mental respects, such as our beliefs, our desires, our character, and so on. Right? So why am I giving this talk here to you today? Well, because I believe that there is a TEDx event going on in Groningen tonight, and because I want to tell you about the relation between equality and responsibility. Right? So why do I do what I do? That's at least partly because of the way I am in mental respects. And that seems to generalize to all actions. So all actions are such that we do them at least partly because of the way we are in mental respects. Okay, so that's the first premise, and that seems a very plausible premise. Second premise, to be responsible for what we do, we must be responsible for the way we are, at least in those mental respects. Now that also seems plausible, and that's shown by the hypnosis example that I started with, right? So in the hypnosis example, I'm not responsible for what I do. Why am I not responsible for what I do? Because I'm not responsible for the way I am in these crucial mental respects, right? I'm not responsible for having the beliefs and desires that I have. And other examples seem to show the same sort of thing. So why are young children not responsible for what they do? Well, plausibly, that's because they're not responsible for the way they are. And why are kleptomaniacs not responsible for stealing? Well, because they're not responsible for having the mental states that make them steal, right? So this also seems to be a very plausible premise. The third premise really results from a question, and the question is, how do we become responsible for the way we are? And a very natural answer to that question is, well, we become responsible for the way we are by doing something to make ourselves the way we are, right? That seems a very natural answer to that question. And if you accept that answer, then it seems you're going to have to accept the third premise. And the third premise says that to be responsible for the way we are, we must have done something in the past for which we must also have been responsible to make ourselves the way we are. Right. Now, the fourth premise. And the fourth premise really just applies the second premise to the third premise, you might say. The fourth premise says that if we were responsible for doing something in the past to make ourselves the way we are, then we must have been responsible for the way we were then, right? So if we were responsible for doing something in the past to make ourselves the way we are, then we must have been responsible for the way we were when we performed that responsible action. And now you can probably see where the argument is going, right? So to have been, it's a kind of regress. So to have been responsible for the way we were then, we must have done something even earlier for which we were also responsible to make ourselves the way we were back then, and so on, all the way to infinity. So in other words, to be responsible for anything that we do, we must perform an infinite series of self-forming actions. Now, of course, the problem is that we just can't perform an infinite series of actions. Human beings have finite lives, right? We don't have an infinite amount of time, so we can't perform the infinite series of actions that's required for us to be responsible for anything that we do. And so then the conclusion of the argument is that all of this shows that we are never responsible for what we do. Okay. Right, so now let's return to equality. So the example of the farmers seemed to show that inequality is unjust if those who have less than others are not responsible for having less than others. Right? That's the thing we started with. Now we have the conclusion of this argument about responsibility, and the conclusion is that we are never responsible for what we do. Now, if we put those two things together, we get the conclusion that justice requires complete equality. Right? And why is that? Well, because inequality is unjust if we're not responsible for the inequality, but we're never responsible for anything. So that means that inequality is always unjust. So in other words, justice requires complete equality. Okay, so but now we might think again. right? So now we might return to the example that I started with. So the example of the two farmers. Suppose you and I are both farmers. You work hard every day, and I'm lazy every day. And at the end of the year, you are much wealthier than I am. If justice requires complete equality, then what will happen at the end of the year if the state implemented this view on justice is that the state would come to you and it would tell you, look, we need to take away some of your additional wealth and we need to give it to Bart, who's been lazy all year, right? Now that seems very counterintuitive, but the important thing here is that we should think about the effect that that's going to have on you, right? So if the state takes away any additional earnings that you have because you work hard and just redistributes them to people who do nothing, then you're not going to have strong incentives to work hard. And if this policy is implemented more generally in society, then incentives to work hard are going to become very, very weak. Obviously, they're not all based on wealth, but nevertheless, they're going to be a lot weaker than they are now. And the effect of that is going to be that our society as a whole is going to become a lot less wealthy than it is now. And that might actually be bad for everybody, right? It's not just bad for you, but it might also be bad for me if my society as a whole becomes less wealthy than it is now. And that's because there's going to be less money up for less wealth up for redistribution if that happens. So, I think that if we change our view about responsibility in the way that's suggested by the argument, we should also change our view about equality. And we should accept the following view. Inequality is just if it benefits the people who have the least. Right? So now we break the link between the justice of equality and responsibility, and we say inequality is just if it benefits the people who have the least. How might inequality benefit the people who have the least? Well, it can do so by providing incentives to work hard. If there is at least some inequality, that will provide an incentive for people to work hard. That will increase the total wealth of our society. And then we can use at least some of the increase in wealth to, via taxation and redistribution, to benefit the people who have the least. And therefore, if there is this kind of incentive providing inequality, everyone will be better off compared to the situation where there is complete social and economic equality. So my overall conclusion is that if we want the future to be more equal, we should change our beliefs about responsibility. Thank you.